Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great day in America, and I will ask Director Larry McKinney to lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance. Mr. McKinney.
Good morning. Please rise and face the American flag. This is the month of the 4th of July, celebrating our independence. Students of history know that it actually took the entire month for the colonies to get the Declaration fully signed. So we'll continue this month to celebrate our Declaration of Independence. I pledge
allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Well done, Mr. McKinney. All right, this morning, announcements and introductions. Is there anybody in the room who would like to introduce themselves? I have one introduction I'd like to make. Any takers? Well, in light of that, I would like to introduce, yes, Mr.
I would like to introduce this lovely young lady standing next to me. Hold on, and that is Minister of Legislative Affairs position over for some time where we've been thinking about how to do that. We're happy to have Heather Baez with us. We just started this week. This is our first official WACO meeting. It will be a regular event. And just to get her started, we gave her a couple of duties, and one of the duties that we assigned her was getting a successful bond approved for the responsibility. So please welcome her, introduce yourselves to her so she can know everybody. She's familiar with a lot of folks in South Orange County, but maybe not necessarily North Orange County. And we will not hold it against her that she previously worked for Senator Dick Ackerman.
Well, let's give a big round, warm welcome. Heather, welcome to Waco, and if there's anything any of us can do for you, please call on us personally. I'm sure everyone is here and willing and ready to accommodate any requests that you might have. So this morning we have a report coming up from Mr. Larry Dick, representing the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California. Mr. Dick.
Thank you, sir. It's great to see most of you. I know I'm not Linda Ackerman, and I know that I won't do as thorough a job as did she, but Linda, if you don't know, has got a bum wing. She's got a broken arm. She's at the bone doctor this morning. So if you have some time during my report when I'm boring you, you might send up a little prayer for her for a speedy recovery, although she did serve her full term on Monday and Tuesday at Met, walking around in her cast. I think she's just getting a checkup. But let's keep her in her thoughts. The good news that I can bring to you this week is that we have added Linda Ackerman as a vice chair of the board at the Metropolitan under the Record Administration, a recognition of her hard work and efforts in the past few years. I think you already know that Brett Barbary has moved from vice chair to chair of business and finance. We have in finance, business and finance, I guess the main thing I can report to you is we continue to try to wind our way through the path on the AV tax. Now, I think the main hang-up is going to be whether or not Los Angeles sees the wisdom in stabilizing our tax rate. As you know, that AV tax was originally put into position on your property taxes to fund the State Water Project. If we stabilize that tax rate, that could be a very powerful force for good, so to speak, as we work our way through financing the Delta fix. So hopefully that's something that will happen. We're going to be talking about that in the August meeting. OPT, the business contracts that we'll be letting, we'll be moving up our small business enterprise target from 18% to 25%. Metropolitan has done a fine job of offering small business entities the opportunity to work with our organization. Metropolitan holds classes so that entrepreneurial types can come and learn how to really fill out a bid, how to do things that can help them grow their business from small businesses to large ones. At the same time, the small business enterprise idea at Met isn't what you and I might think of as small businesses. They still have to be several $1 million. and even the small ones have to post performance bonds. Our ultimate and most important responsibility is to protect the ratepayers to get the job that they deserve to have done for them. But we've been lucky the past few years. We've been able to find entrepreneurial spirits, a lot of disabled American veteran companies, a lot of veteran companies, a lot of minority-owned companies. We've averaged 31%. So it's our way of helping build business for the future. In water planning, you've got the Department of Water Resources. You heard in the paper yesterday about how they want to have mandatory rationing. I'm sure you'll be hearing a lot more about that. A lot of conversation there. They're worrying about somebody, washing their car, yet we still have so many illegal diverters taking water in the Delta, and nobody's doing anything about that. I mean, I don't understand that. I mean, the bank's being robbed, and they're over there worrying about your parking meters expired. I don't understand that. Legal and claims, we continue to fight our way through the San Diego County Water Authority lawsuits. We've invested about $15 million of the ratepayers' money at this point. The only highlight of that is about 25% of that is San Diego's money, since they do help pay the bill. We have a new legal team, Quinn Emanuel. This firm is a litigation firm only. They only do litigation, and they're darn good at it. They're darn good at it. They're so good at it, my understanding is last year their partners were the highest earning law partners in the United States of America. So sometimes, even as cheap as I am, because I throw around manhole covers easier than nickels, you just don't want to be dealing with the lowest bidder. We need to have this over, we need to win, and that's why we've hired them. Ladies and gentlemen, the only other thing I can see here is that I had written down here, make sure I introduce Heather Baez. As usual, Carl did all the heavy lifting. But I'd also want to remind you that on July 30th, we're having a dinner to recognize our new Met chairman, Randy Record. There'll be a cocktail hour reception beforehand. Any questions, please see any of us. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Swan with the Aqua report.
In the spirit of keeping these remarks brief, because we have speakers come a long way, Aqua is Region 8, 9, and 10 of planning the conference. It's going to be the 27th, 28th of October. We don't shy away from controversy. Right now, the planning committee, which is the chairs and vice chairs of 3 regions, are planning to review the lawsuits, the big lawsuits. And Larry just talked about the Met San Diego lawsuit. Many of you in this room probably don't know what those issues are in detail. This is a conference to talk about, what those issues are from both points of view, and you can make up your own mind. So you hear a lot about it, but you don't know a lot about it. I'm sure. Also in there will be this the lawsuit between the tribes in the Coachella Valley on water rights and use, and also discussions about rate structure. So it will be controversial. There are people that don't like that, but that's how you learn things, and that's what the tentative program is for now. Thank you.
Jeff Mosier, are you in the room, sir? Mr. Mosier, excellent. Happy to have you here. I can help you with that.
Thank you, Sean. So I'm Jeff Mosier with the National Water Research Institute. It's good to be here. I was here a few months ago giving you an update on what the state is doing from a direct potable reuse point of view. I thought I'd update you on that because there's a lot of activity going on. So there's a sheet coming around, and it'll give you a little bit about the background, but there is some legislative mandates for the state to look at direct potable reuse. And they've set up an expert panel of folks who are academics, researchers, that sort of thing. NWRI is administering that panel. They have met once in March. They reviewed DPR research. They developed a set of reports on that. They're up on our website. You can download them, look at them if you're interested. But there's also an advisory committee that the state had to develop as part of this to advise the expert panel. They've met once in February. They're meeting again today in this room later this morning. So at the end of your meeting, we're going to start changing the room around for that meeting. And that that committee is really a set of stakeholders that's supposed to raise questions that the expert panel will consider. The names of those folks are on the sheet that I passed out. You'll see familiar faces. Mike Wayner of Orange County Water District is on there. There's folks from around the state, San Diego, Marcy Steyer from the city of San Diego. There's an environmentalist. So it's an important group to try to look at some of the questions that may come up from a direct potable reuse point of view. Is it safe? How do we do the monitoring? All those types of things. I expect we'll hear from them. Oh, one thing I should mention, if you haven't heard, the drinking water program, which was in the California Department of Public Health, as of July 1st, moved over to the state board. That was done through the budget process. That has officially occurred. Their emails have changed. So they are now the Division of Drinking Water in the State Water Resources Control Board. So you'll see that notation on what I handed out. So this process has started. It will go for about a year and a half, 2 years. At the end of that, we will have a report from our expert panel on the feasibility of criteria for DPR. So they'll be meeting every 3 or 4 months for the next 18 months or so. The other thing I want to mention is many of you know that the NWRI gives out a $50,000 research award every year. It's called the Clark Prize. And this year it was going to be awarded to David Sedlak. He's a professor at UC Berkeley. It's interesting, David Sedlak was funded by NWRI about 15 years ago in some of his early research looking at NDMA in facilities such as here where it's formed by the use of chloramines. So he's been very active in terms of water quality. He's doing a lot more in terms of constructed wetlands, urban water. He's part of a center at Stanford that's looking at urban water from a 21st century point of view. It's a National Science Foundation funded center, $40 million over 10 years. He wrote a book recently. It was published in January. It's for the layperson. It's called Water 4.0. He talks about how we need to go to the next, we've done wastewater treatment, we've done water treatment, and now we need to do more of what's being done here at Orange County and other places in California. We need to use the water that's in our backyard, and that means a lot of water recycling, and do it in a sustainable way. So, Sean, I'll stop there and turn it back over to you. Thanks for a chance to being here.
Thank you very much, Jeff. So at this point in our program is the time for me to introduce our guest speaker, and his name is Daren Bakst. Sorry, Daren. Correct me if I'm got that all wrong there. Daren studies and writes about agricultural subsidies, property rights, environmental policy, food labeling, and related issues at the Heritage Foundation. He's a research fellow in agricultural policy. The Heritage Foundation was founded in 1973. It's a research and educational institution, a think tank, whose mission is to formulate and promote conservative public policies based on the principles of free enterprise, limited government, individual freedom, traditional American values, and a strong national defense. Mr. Bakst joined Heritage's Rowe Institute for Economic Policy Studies in May 2013. Previously, he was a policy counsel for the United States Chamber of Commerce, where he focused on regulatory reform as well as food and agricultural policy. He's appeared in or been quoted by media outlets such as the Wall Street Journal, the USA Today, the Washington Times, CNN, and the National Review. Mr. Bakst, who hails from West Palm Beach, Florida, received his bachelor's and master's degrees from George Washington University. He's a licensed attorney and holds a law degree from the University of Miami and a Master of Laws degree from the American University. A smart guy, to say the least. Today, he will speak about the Clean Water Act and the Water of the U.S. rules. Please join me in welcoming Daren.
Okay. Well, thank you for inviting me. I appreciate it. I'm going to talk about I think the most important issue of the day, and that's where's LeBron James going to be playing next year. As a Miami Heat fan, this is certainly of concern to me. I actually do think there's a good chance he's going to go to Cleveland, and if that happens, it's going to be rebuilding time for the Heat, I think. I am going to talk about a proposed rule from the EPA and the Army Corps of Engineers, and it's referred to as a Waters of the U.S. rule. And let's see if I can get this to work. Okay, good. Wow. The rule itself, the proposed rule, is well over 300 pages. And most of it is kind of this preamble language that is kind of the EPA discussing how they're interpreting the language. There's a lot to digest. It's complicated. So I'm not going to pretend to say that I know everything about the rule and how it's going to apply in practice, because I don't think anybody knows how that's going to apply in practice. So, okay, in April, not that long ago, the EPA and the Corps jointly published what's called this Waters of the United States proposed rule, and I'll explain why this rule is important and what it is. And this rule is going to make major changes to water to the U.S., and that's the kind of the key definition in the Clean Water Act as to what kind of waters are covered under the law. And it would make changes to the regulations that have been in place for more than 25 years. There's a lot of talk that this proposed rule is not really going to be doing much that's different. Well, in fact, it's going to be a lot of new changes to existing law. And it's an extremely controversial rule. About a couple weeks ago at the Heritage Foundation, we held an event where we had the Farm Bureau, we had the counties, we had the home builders, and we had some lawyers too. And I think what it showed was kind of the wide concern that exists across industry and across the ideological spectrum as it relates to this particular proposed rule. Now, I want to stress it is proposed. It's not final yet, and we'll discuss that too. Okay, so why is this rule important? Why are you even here to discuss? Why am I here? Why did you bring me here? You may still be wondering that after this presentation. When you think about the Clean Water Act, this rule there may not be a more important rule, regulations as it relates to the Clean Water Act, than this particular rule, because it actually defines the jurisdiction that the EPA and the Corps have under the Clean Water Act. In other words, what kind of waters are covered under the rule. So in the statute, there's something called navigable waters, and that's what's covered under the law. And then it's specifically defined as then waters of the U.S. That's where you get the waters of the U.S. language. And that definition applies across the entire statute. So all the different sections, all the different permitting sections, like Section 404, Section 402, you have the Section 303 program as well, are going to be affected by whatever is defined as waters of the U.S. On a practical level, the way this is defined, the way the waters are defined, what kind of waters are considered to be jurisdictional, basically what the EPA and the Corps can have jurisdiction over, is basically telling private landowners, for example, what you can and can't do on your property. If it's a very broad interpretation, there's a very distinct possibility that some things that you don't need to get a permit for right now, you may actually need to get a permit for in the future. Same thing goes for someone like for farmers. Even ordinary farming activities may be affected as a result of a very broad interpretation of what kind of waters would be covered under this rule. That might mean like pesticides or building a fence on a farm, for example. Home builders are concerned about it because it certainly could have an impact on the cost of building a home. Property owners, any property owner could be impacted through this particular proposed rule. This is a rule that impacts property rights, can have an impact on local land use decisions as well. So it's certainly got a major impact on property rights issues, and it's interesting. I was just looking at a Congressional Research Service report this morning, and it said that at least under existing law, about 75% of the jurisdictional wetlands right now are on private property. So if you expand this definition and broaden it even more, I mean, I mean, it's already, a lot of the wetlands are already, a lot of them on private property. It's just going to be even a bigger kind of land grab. It's, you know, it's kind of like a water grab, but in many ways, as we're going to see, it's almost a land grab as well. Okay, so more waters might be covered. The Clean Water Act is, and has always been, about cooperative federalism. This idea that the federal and state government are partners as it relates to the Clean Water Act and implementing the law. Within the statute, you can see the language right there. Right near the top of the statute is the policy of Congress to recognize, preserve, and protect the primary responsibilities and rights of states to prevent, reduce, and eliminate pollution, etc. States have a major role in implementation of the Clean Water Act. If the federal government decides it's going to take a much bigger role in it and going to grab and try to take control and have more permitting decisions, and consider that more waters are kind of under the jurisdiction of the federal government, then the state role gets pushed out. And one of the reasons why it's important to have state input and local input is the fact that individuals on the local and state level have a closer connection to those people on the state and local levels. There's greater accountability. You know, if I'm here in this meeting, I can hold my local officials accountable a lot more, and I could talk to them face to face, whereas it's kind of tough for me to have a face-to-face discussion with somebody in the EPA or the Corps. It becomes extremely difficult to do that, and it's not going to happen, or they'll just ignore me. Also, you know your community better than people in DC know your community. You know the needs of your waters within Orange County than somebody that works on Capitol Hill. They may not think that. Trust me, they don't. And as somebody who's worked at the state level in public policy, you can always sense like the people working in DC always thought, oh, they're better. And now that I work in DC, I can tell you I think I'm better now. So I guess you kind of get suckered into it. Now, with the expansion of the Clean Water Act, it triggers other potential laws as well. That includes NEPA. So if you have federal permit issues, you might have NEPA involved, Nature Species Act. These are all create more obstacles for activities that you might want to engage in. And I'm not just talking about private landowners, I'm talking about public landowners too. This is some data from the Rapanos case, which is from 2006. So it's a little outdated, but this is from the Supreme Court opinion, and this is the cost for Section 404 permits. And you might be able to see what it costs. It says the average applicant for an individual permit spends 788 days and $271,000 including the process. That's in 2006. It's probably, I don't see it being streamlined anymore, and it probably costs a lot more. And the problem is you can't get around the permitting process. If you want to take certain action on your property, or if you do something without permission or without the permit, you could face criminal liability or civil fines. You throw in NEPA issues, makes it even more complicated. You throw in ESA, Nature Species Act issues, takes it to a whole new level. All right, the legal background, I'm sure. All right, as I said, even though the rule is called Waters of the United States, the statutory language in the law itself, Clean Water Act, is actually navigable waters, and then it kind of defines it further as waters of the U.S. and territorial seas. But the focus has been on waters of the United States. What does that mean? Now, in 1972, when the Clean Water Act was passed, for the most part, it was navigable waters really it was narrowly defined for the most part. But then, as you might imagine, the agencies started to interpret the term much broader and just kept interpreting more broadly and more broadly over decades. And then in 2001, the Supreme Court, in a case called, as you can see, Solid Waste Agency of Northern Cook County versus Army Corps, the Supreme Court was looking at what was called the migratory bird rule. And the Corps was arguing that because these birds were migrating and crossing state lines, that should therefore give them jurisdiction over bodies of water, intrastate bodies of water that are actually kind of isolated. Well, the Supreme Court struck that down and said you can't do that. And that provided a little bit of clarity, at least as it relates to kind of these more isolated water bodies intrastate. That's easy enough. But then there was a little bit of confusion because in 2006, there's a case called Rapanos versus U.S. And you didn't have kind of the traditional 5-4 decision or the 9-0 decision. You had what was kind of a four justices kind of had one opinion. Justice Kennedy came up with his own concurrence, and then you had the 4 dissenters. So it's kind of hard to know what the actual rationale of the court was. So it's a kind of a 4-1-4 decision. So Scalia, writing for the plurality, kind of explains what I think a lot of people think waters of the U.S. would in fact be. And that is, as you can see, it's basically what you think: streams, oceans, water bodies that you're pretty much permanent and standing, flowing bodies of water. And it would not include intermittent or kind of occasional flows of water. But the courts have not really followed that. They've looked at the Kennedy opinion, the concurrence, and where he talks about a significant nexus, so that a water body in combination potentially with other water bodies, if it has a kind of an ecological impact on a navigable water, that might be good enough. Problem is, it's really hard to know what he's talking about, and therefore it's caused a lot of confusion. So in fairness to the EPA and Corps, and it's always tough sometimes for me to want to be fair, the EPA, but there is some confusion as relates to the law and what the definition is and how it should be applied. And through this proposed rule, I can't say they're actually clarifying much, but I think that's kind of what they're trying to do. All right, so bottom line, what waters are covered under this proposed rule? I know I won't test you on all that. The key thing is, here's a list. There's some exceptions, but tributaries. We have a new definition of tributaries. So a tributary is a water physically characterized by the presence of a bed and banks and ordinary high water mark. It does include natural, man-made, man-altered water. It includes waters such as rivers, streams, lakes, ponds, impoundments, canals, and ditches. And it, in fact, does cover perennial, intermittent, and ephemeral flow. It covers a lot. Definitely covers a lot there. Now, there are exceptions to the ditches that are covered, but without getting into this in detail, let's just say the ditches exception is extremely narrow. So you're going to hear the EPA say, well, it doesn't really cover ditches, there are exceptions in place. But the exceptions are so narrow, it may not even be real, they may be mythical, actually. So here's some pictures. This is courtesy of the Farm Bureau's testimony. Yeah, this is kind of on a farm. And I'm just going to go through these pictures quickly. Some of the water is that you'll have water that would be kind of lying on the grass in a depressed area. And then after a couple of weeks, it will kind of go away eventually. But that would probably be covered under the waters of the U.S. rule. So because there's some water at some point, that's good enough to be considered waters of the U.S. Don't think of the waters as something that has to be there all the time. It could be something that might be there for a couple weeks and then be gone the rest of the year. Now there are some other, I don't want to get too legalistic, but there are other definitions of waters as well. It would cover waters that are adjacent to kind of these waters of the U.S. as well. And adjacent, when you have to kind of keep defining what adjacent means, you know that you're in trouble, because it's considered bordering, contiguous, and then there's something called neighboring. And as you can see, the way I was thinking about this last night actually was, it's kind of like horseshoes. Being close is good enough. Horseshoes. So that's right. And that, in fact, as long as you're somewhat close, you're doing fine. And yes, if I was allowed to, I would have not used that word. Use something alternative. So neighboring is kind of typical with rules and law. You have a definition, and then you have to define the word that's in that particular definition, and then there's probably some word there, you have to define that. It becomes kind of confusing, and it's done in a way sometimes on the surface, something may not look too bad, but once you start to dig deeper into it, you realize how problematic a proposed rule might be or statute might be. So neighboring means that it includes waters located within a riparian area or floodplain. It can be anywhere in those riparian area or floodplain. And now there's new definitions of riparian area and floodplains within the rules as well. And then one of the questions that I knew would probably be brought up, because I know groundwater is important. Is groundwater exempted? And the answer is yes. But if you see the above exclusion, or the inclusion of, in that neighboring definition right there, it talks about shallow subsurface hydraulic connection. There is no distinction made in the rule as to what's the difference between shallow subsurface waters and groundwater. So the connection, so while they say groundwater is exempted from the rule, certainly it plays a part, well, depending on what shallow subsurface waters means, plays some type of role in trying to figure out whether or not a water is considered to be jurisdictional. In other words, something where you might actually have to get a permit and be covered by the Corps can actually cover it. Go ahead.
Is there a definition of the word shallow?
No. Yeah. No, nothing. No.
1 or 2 foot,
And I think, I would not be shocked if the EPA does provide some clarification on it. However, I don't know whether or not that clarification would be done through an actual final rule to try to draw the distinction between groundwater and shallow subsurface. That is something that's important for them to try to, and it's kind of what I'm saying with this rule, that there's more to the eye. I mean, you kind of have to dig deeper into it. And to be honest, I'm kind of in the process myself a lot of organizations doing the same thing, just trying to realize what the implications really are of this rule. But there's no question that there's a broader reach here. And then one of the last ways that the agency is trying to get, EPA and the Corps are trying to get broader authority, is through the significant nexus kind of argument. The way I describe it is kind of confusing, but that's kind of what the rule says. But if there's one water body within a particular area, and it may have very little, if nothing, to do with a kind of a wetland, some other type of water body, navigable water, then that's okay if you can kind of take that little water body and in combination with other different similarly situated water bodies, you can call it kind of like this single little landscape unit, as the EPA says in the rule. And if that landscape unit has an impact on this other water body, that's good enough. So what's happening is you expand the definition of what kind of waters there are, like a ditch, and ditches might be covered now, ephemeral waters with ephemeral flow, something that's basically maybe a puddle, effectively. And then on top of that, because you've expanded the definition of what kind of waters are covered. You then kind of brought it even further by, if you look at areas around those water bodies, can also potentially be covered as well. So we're talking about a lot of jurisdiction for under the Clean Water Act as a result of this proposed rule. Now, I wanted to bring up the question of sound science. We always want to talk about sound science. It should be the basis of any type of proposed rule. So, personally, the interpretation, actually, the legal aspects really should be the key issue here. But I'm going to tell you just some process issues, because I'm kind of into these process type issues. So July 2013, the EPA assembles an scientific advisory board to peer review the study that they developed. It really was just a literature review. And the EPA says that this literature review is critical to the actual rule, this Waters of the United States rule. But what happens? In September, EPA sends this proposed rule that I'm talking about to the Office of Management and Budget, and the Office of Management and Budget reviews rules. So they draft the rule before the Scientific Advisory Board even meets in December. I mean, I think it just kind of tells you. I'll let you figure out what that tells you. Yeah, that's horseshoes, right? Now, they'll say, well, we're going to take into account what the Scientific Advisory Board says for when it comes to the final rule. But that's not good enough. If you're in the public and you're providing comments to a proposed rule, you're supposed to be providing comments of what you think is actually supposed to be based on sound science. Providing comments on something that, well, I guess they think that either is not, more of the story is they're probably just going to simply not pay too much attention to what the Scientific Advisory Board says, or, of course, the Scientific Advisory Board just looks good. And there's not going to be many changes to the final rule as a result of the assessment. Now, I'm not sitting here and tell you that I think the Scientific Advisory Board, that the review is going to be perfect and going to be great, or that I would agree with it, or is even going to be rational, for that matter. But I will say that they certainly should have reviewed it beforehand. And I think this is a process issue that I hope, and I actually should expect, could hurt the EPA down the line, because it makes it look like it's arbitrary and capricious to actually not consider the scientific review that they consider to be so critical, and to not have the draft proposed rule, the proposed rule reflect that science beforehand, I think is extremely problematic for them. Before I look forward, let me just say there's actually been a lot of attention recently about this proposed rule, and certainly within the agriculture community. I wanted to. So Gina McCarthy, EPA administrator, went to Missouri yesterday or 2 days ago, and trying to kind of mend fences and bring peace to EPA and the farming community. It didn't help that she kind of went there beforehand and kind of was calling the agriculture concerns, silly. So that didn't play out well. Even if you're not a political consultant, I think you can kind of figure that one out. There are exemptions that are mentioned that you'll hear the EPA talk about. 56 exemptions for farming, but that's part of something called an interpretive rule, which is kind of distinct from this proposed rule. But it also, those exemptions for farming, first of all, there are exemptions that already exist under Section 404 permitting. And so these exemptions likely already exist anyway. You don't need to spell them out. It could be nice to spell them out, but the problem is when you spell out 56 different exemptions, first of all, they're forgetting some. And it only covers Section 404 of the law, the permitting law. It doesn't cover other aspects of the Clean Water Act. So they're going to say that the farming, they don't have to worry about it at all because of these exemptions, but only under this maybe one particular part of the law. In addition, it only applies to farmers who have been continuous farming since like 1977. So anybody new, well, you're out of luck. It also is placing conditions on whether or not the exemptions apply because you have to meet certain conservation practices, which is, I believe, a new kind of requirement in place. So you can kind of understand why the farming community is concerned. The exemptions, again, not exactly, it looks like one thing, but it's not really what it looks like. So looking forward, comments are due October 20th, 2014. They extended the comment period, so it's now up to October 20th. I don't know to what extent your organizations submit comments on federal rules, but if you do, this is a good one. Submit comments to. On the Hill right now, there is language on the House side in at least one, maybe two appropriations bills to withhold funding for implementation of this rule. Whether or not that actually is going to go anywhere is probably unlikely, only because of the appropriations process. Ultimately, when all said and done, usually what happens is appropriations bills by themselves don't usually pass, and then usually get this massive omnibus appropriations bill at the end of each year. Probably get something like that, or a continuing resolution. I don't know that you'll actually get anything on. It's unlikely. Now, there is some legislation to try to define waters of the U.S. The Congress would actually try to provide the clarification. It hasn't gone anywhere. Ultimately, the courts, and this is a problem across the board, defer to, well, I think it's a problem across the board. Courts defer to agencies. They're not analyzing the statutory language themselves necessarily. They're looking as to whether or not the agency interpretation of the Clean Water Act, or for that matter any other statute, is reasonable. And if it is, the courts will defer to the agencies. That's kind of how our the regulatory process works. I'll get into my spiel. Congress delegates a lot of power to the agencies. Then the agencies they get all that power. Then the agencies issue kind of these very broad, or they push the limit as relates to the law. And then the courts don't really provide a check on the agencies. Like I said, they defer to the kind of agency interpretation. And one, I don't think we're going to get really good definition from the court as to what waters of the U.S. means. Certainly the makeup of the court right now is relatively similar to what it was in 2006. It might be different, but I don't see it. You're not going to get it's not going to change from Rapanos, I don't think. And then the agencies, of course, are going to keep pushing, as they always have, their reach under this law. So ultimately, I think Congress has to take action. Yes, I know that sounds amusing, but ultimately Congress does have to try to define what navigable waters means. And I kind of failed to mention is that this isn't if you define navigable waters and waters of the U.S. in a narrow fashion, that somehow that means you don't care about the environment or water or whatever. The Clean Water Act is a federal law, and it's designed, again, to be that partnership between the federal government and states. And if you define it, not narrowly, but kind of the way I think it was always meant to be interpreted, there's nothing wrong with that. You do that, and then you let the states and local governments fill in the gaps where they think it's necessary. And at that point, I'll take question.
Nowhere did I see the word flood in any of this conversation. And yet it seems to me that floodwaters are the major, certainly one of the major sources of water. And they're the biggest challenge we have. In other words, the states kind of take care of individual things. But floods cover statewide, And I recall that there was a gathering to be held about a year ago where they were just going to, the various state representatives were going to get together, and that subject was sort of thrown out. We don't want to talk about floods. And, you know, we have an enormous amount of need for water in the West. We've got this surplus of water in the Midwest. And my wife's favorite thing was, why don't they build a pipe? And everybody would fall on the floor and laugh. But everything you presented here is terribly convoluted, tangled, and immensely involved, and you've made some comments yourself about it. But it seems like that would be the logical place to start, is what do we do with the flood, waters, damage, et cetera, and recognizing the fact that that's a big problem in this country, I think. Now, you know, maybe I'm just jaded, but, you know, all I saw was the expenditure of very high levels of salary, very high salary level people were going to be involved throughout. And the EPA reminds me of the EPA of 1971. You know, we still haven't recovered from that. So, my question, I think, really revolves around the flood waters. Never mind the ditches.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that. I think within the Clean Water Act framework, I mean, is the idea to try to, you're talking about the kind of the pipe idea, and try to.
A ditch. Why don't we build a ditch?
Well, if you do, you need a permit. Yeah, I mean, that's what will, honestly, that's what's going to happen, is that, and what the bigger problem is that the more permitting requirements that are imposed on not just private property owners, but states and local governments, the costlier it's going to be, the more difficult it's going to be to actually meet the needs of your communities as well. Now, certainly it might be appropriate under the current statute to have, I mean, there is a permitting process, but to kind of make it so you're expanding it so much that you're having to get permits for things that you never would have ever imagined, Congress never imagined in 1972 would be the case, or that you don't have to get a permit for now, it's just going to make things even more difficult. And given the kind of the concerns that you talked about, making it even more difficult, is probably the last thing we need to do right now. Sorry, go ahead.
Daren, after studying this, and you've got some of the history here, what would you recommend that the verbiage be for the definition of waters? If you have some environmental background, then you know you're speaking of Southern California, where we've lost 95% of our wetlands. All of our coastal wetlands are basically gone, with a few concrete estuaries in Newport Bank Bay, and that's the end of it. So we want to preserve some of our wetlands and the benefits we get from water quality, and for the migratory birds and other species. But at the same time, we don't want to burden on the permitting process to do improvements. So how do you do this?
One, I really do believe strongly in the respecting this cooperative federalism idea. So I would probably kind of codify this, for the most generally, I would codify into law the plurality of opinion in Rapanos, that we're talking about kind of continuous flow. We're talking about kind of these navigable waters, even though the waters of the U.S. is kind of a sub kind of definition or clarification of navigable waters, it means something still. And I think we are talking about kind of streams, ponds, lakes, etc. So I would kind of go with that definition, but recognizing that states and local governments should certainly have the ability to take actions as they deem fit. But again, I think it's kind of a partnership on the water issue.
I work for a stormwater agency, so my question is, look like the extension of the definition for smaller channels, ditches, could cover smaller, storm drains or smaller storm channels that have intermittent nuisance flows. And I know your emphasis probably is more on the agriculture issues, but in an urban environment, what do you see the impact for the cities and counties?
There's a recent case where the EPA was trying to say that the stormwater was a pollutant, I think, and they got shot down there. But in this instance, I think you'd be okay with it. I mean, stormwater itself won't be. Whether or not the ditches could be potentially covered, I think it might be, but I would need to look at it more carefully. One of the things that I do think is extremely important for really kind of organizations across states and also in DC is I think that various interests need to think about what types of activities do they engage in that they think would actually be potentially covered under this proposed rule. Because when you talk about this, it's like, who cares? How does this impact me personally? And it's important to kind of, and then you get into the weeds of the regulations and Section 404 and 402. It gets over people's heads, including my own head. So it's important to try to lay out how this actually could apply in practice and why this could have an impact. What kind of things could be impacted in the agriculture sector, for example? What kind of things could be impacted for a municipality or a water district for counties? And just lay out in plain English what those are. And I think that's a great way to try to get the public, and also because private property owners are also going to be impacted. Home builders are going to have higher costs. Well, guess what? That means housing prices are going to go up as a result. How much, I don't know, but it's going to have an impact.
Great job on doing this, Daren. I appreciate it. A question that I have for you, as this passes, say, from the federal to the state level, and sorry for the multi-part question, but one, does California have California state waters of the United States? And the second part of that question, as this promulgates through, could the state also reinterpret sections or firm up sections of the federal waters of the U.S. that could impose either more limits or decrease less limits? What's our exposure?
On the second question, first, on the definition itself, that's really what we're talking about here. The federal government defines it, and can the state expand upon, as long as it doesn't conflict with the actual interplay between the different programs and then the statute. But if you wanted to have your own kind of, to regulate more broadly than the federal government you can. As a general rule, states can always exceed federal standards. You can't go below the federal standards, but you can go above the standards. But again, as it relates to the interplay between the federal, kind of the Clean Water Act, I don't know that you can kind of have something that's maybe in conflict. And the first question was, I'm not sure if I know the answer to the first one, whether or not there's a California waters of the U.S. I'm not sure. What do you mean by that?
Well, the states, as you pointed out, they obviously adopt more restrictive conditions for it. So I was wondering if California had a unique adaptation of the existing waters of the U.S. and if it will also open the opportunity for comment at another level. It makes it a little bit more complex. And as you pointed out, a lot of the language, bluntly, is interpreted. And are we more stringent or less stringent, say, if it gets reinterpreted by the state? And do we need to also consider when we comment on this rulemaking to approach it at the federal level and in addition the state level if it passes through?
I think I'm not sure that familiar with the California's law, but I will say that as with any state, I'm sure with California there's unique interests involved. And there are things happening in California that may not be happening, and I was probably just reading some stuff recently with California that don't happen in other states. It is important for the EPA to understand what that might be. It's possible that, let's say, if California has been regulating something that very well may be covered now, could be covered under this proposed rule. The experience that California has had, good or bad, should probably be communicated to the EPA one way or another on that. Go ahead.
As a practical matter, has anybody looked at the cost and the number of people involved in policing this and the lawyering community that's going to result from this? It's going to make the border problem look like nothing. Here's the ditch police, okay, you had a pool over here, I'm trying to find you. They better look at this. I mean, everybody's going to be a lawyer and working for the government.
Well, I am a lawyer, so I love this rule. Well, see, I'm not going to be on the government side. I'm going to be on the defense side. That's where the money will be. Because it's going to be, honestly, you saw how kind of convoluted it is. It's going to be litigated. One point I should say is just because, just on the timing of this, okay, you got the comment period that ends October 20th, but it's going to take a little while for them to finalize the rule. I do think they want to get this done before the administration is, out of there. But this is going to be litigated. This is going to take a while. And who knows what will happen in another administration, how this will play out. But given the way the language is drafted and how, this exists now with the Clean Water Act. It's a lot of lawyers making lots of money dealing with defending property owners and governments, and just how convoluted it can be. And I think this will just make it even worse. So yes, it's kind of a full employment act for lawyers. So, okay, one more question. Okay.
Yeah, since Kennedy probably took a position, I gather, that he didn't want to be very explicit. So basically, he's leaving it up, I take it, to the administrative law judges to at some point begin to gather a record and actually define all of the things that you're leaving open. So the questions really get down to, there are ways in which these things get defined, but you're really saying prospectively, where is it going, and that's the argument, I take it?
Well, when Kennedy, in his opinion, I think it was kind of didn't want to be too prescriptive, apparently. But as a result, one of the key reasons why you go to the court, why we have a court system, is to have some predictability in the law and to understand how to comply with the law. Creating this kind of ecological significant nexus test or whatever that is just so amorphous and you can't figure out doesn't do anybody any good.
But isn't that how law builds anyway? It's a case law system, basically. Yeah. So what it is administrative law judges begin a ruling and you get definitions, and that's how you begin to get predictability, right?
You do. It wouldn't be through, in this case, it wouldn't be administrative law judges. It would be just through, just the federal court system. Right. So you would, but then that becomes, then you're getting constant litigation, and you can see how, since it's so broad, you'd have so many different kind of fact patterns that would exist that it would be very difficult to develop any kind of law in this area. And in fact, that's exactly what's happened. Is there's so much confusion that there is a need for a little bit more clarity. And on that point, the EPA and the Corps, and I think pretty much everybody, would agree that there needs to be some clarity. Their clarity is that they should have jurisdiction over almost everything, whereas my clarity is they need to get back to what the statute actually said in the first place. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I bring this to your attention. I was the one specifically advocating to bring Mr. Bakst to our audience here, and specifically for the reason that the business of the Orange County Water District is to deal in waters that are shallow subsurface and hydraulically connected. And in addition to that definition, if it's obvious to me, but we are recharging this groundwater basin with recycled water, and all of everything that Mr. Bakst talked about this morning is fully encompassed in the operation of the Orange County Water District and has the potential to dramatically impact how we refill the groundwater basin that all of you and your constituents depend on. So I think that as a matter of policy discussion, it's important to be in front of these things rather than after them, and there is an opportunity for us to engage as policymakers and and weigh in on this issue before it's implemented into law. I think those of us who are elected to local office like the idea of local control. We think here at the Orange County Water District that we know how to manage a groundwater basin, and we think that we do a good job. Others around the world have given us notable awards, recognition for the scientific and technological application of the groundwater basin management that we've applied for all of these many 80 years, and we appreciate your support in that. I have 3 announcements, and then I'd like to bring Director Ackerman up to talk about CEQA reform briefly. Mr. Dick briefly touched on this topic, but the State Water Resources Control Board is in the process of accepting comments until July 14th regarding emergency water conservation regulations. He and I would both advocate that you connect with your water managers and talk about the concept of illegal diversions. Before we start policing our local community about watering their lawn, I think it's important that we go after the low-hanging fruit and where the majority of the water is being lost, and we would agree that this is in the concept of illegal diversions. That's the key word. It's coming up, or at least for your consideration, is the idea that WACO supporting the concept of a delta fix. Metropolitan has letters prepared if anybody is interested at your deliberative body and suggesting to the powers that be that you are in support of a fix for the delta, and Mr. Dick would be happy to talk to you about that. And then the next issue is that the upcoming elections, many of us, including me, are up for election this fall. At the next WACO meeting, I would invite all of you, if you have campaign literature that you'd like to distribute among your peers in this networking forum, please feel free to bring it and put it into the back of the room. If you would like an opportunity to speak, I would request that you simply fill out a opportunity or a request to speak card, and perhaps we could give campaign speeches to each other, but perhaps that's not necessary. At this point, Mr. Ackerman, I'd like to bring you up and ask you to talk about CEQA reform. We have 13 minutes left in our meeting here, and so you have the floor, sir.
Thank you. I usually get introduced as Linda's husband, so I appreciate that kind introduction. A few years ago, a Democrat state senator was elected in the Central Valley by the name of Michael Rubio, not to be confused with the other Rubio. And one of the first things he did when he got elected was to introduce a bill for CEQA reform, and that got a lot of people's attention. The basis of the bill was not to change any of the environmental standards of CEQA, to basically allow a streamlining, a modernization, try to cut down duplicative reviews and various things like that. And it got a lot of attention. And the governor even indicated at the beginning that he was going to be supportive of it. So a lot of us are watching to see what was going to happen. A number of groups formed right away. One of them was one called the Public Works Coalition, which is mainly public groups. There was a business group that was started. The California Chamber was started. But a lot of us believe that the best chance to get input into this was use public agencies, because that's sort of related to the government, it's public money, and they have the same problem that everybody else does. So the California Special Districts Association started a group called the Public Works Coalition. MODOC is a member of that. I think Irvine Ranch is, and I would encourage all of the districts to take a look at this. One of the interesting parts about this group is it's not just water world. It's school districts, sanitation districts, mosquito districts, all kinds of districts, which makes it harder to get a coalition to agree on what's going to happen, but I think it's definitely a step in the right direction. They came up with a number of recommendations which unfortunately got watered down, and over the years basically none of them got through. The California Chamber took a little more active role last year and actually proposed a bill that was going to do a little more, and that got shot down too. But I want to thank Daren for making a few points for my speech. He talked about the delay and cost of every project that goes on, both public and private, and a lot of that has to do with CEQA in California. While we thought this was dead, it is dead, sort of dead for this year. The Senate Committee, the Senate Judiciary, and the Senate Environmental Quality Committee have sent out a letter, and there's a copy over there which I would ask you to pick up on the way out, to ask all affected stakeholders to tell us what your experience has been with CEQA. And they're interesting. One of the questions is tell us the bad stuff, which that's pretty easy, and the other one is tell us the good stuff, which that may be a little more difficult, and then give some examples. But I would encourage all of the districts, all of the cities, anybody involved in public works for this standpoint, to pick up that questionnaire and respond to it. We're trying to get more and more people. We have a pretty good representation statewide of various public entities that are involved in this, and I think the more public entities we get, the better it's going to be. A lot of times the legislature, when they hear the developer complaining, they say, well, that's just a developer, he's trying to make money, so we're not going to give as much credence to that. But public works groups, when they start to speak and tell how much it costs, how much more it costs to build a school building or a dam or a water project or whatever, I think that's going to have a lot more impact with the legislature. Many people have asked me, and I've been on this committee now for about 2 or 3 years, what good are you doing? And right now, we're not doing a whole lot of good, but I think we have to step it up, especially since the governor has indicated many times that he thinks CEQA should be modernized too, and I think this is an opportunity to do it. But we're looking for actual case studies, and if it didn't happen in your district or your city, but if you know of something else, fill it out and send it in, because I think this is definitely an opportunity where we can do something. You know, all of us have heard the horror stories of CEQA, and unfortunately most of them are true. And I think this is time that we might have a chance this next legislative go-around to try and do something. Many of the new legislators up there are now going to be there for 12 years instead of 6 or 8, whatever it's going to be. So I think that gives us a little better impact in trying to change something. The people that came out in opposition to this, which is probably no surprise, are the public employees unions and many of the environmental groups. And as you may know, a lot of CEQA projects get tied up now, particularly on the union side, just trying to get some advantages for their particular union. It may have nothing to do with CEQA, but it's used sort of as an extortion technique to try and change the project or try and get money out of the project. So I would urge all of you to get involved in this. It's run by the Special Districts Association, Christina Loki up in Sacramento. We have generally meetings every month or two, and you can call in. You don't have to be up there. But it's something that I think can grow, and the more agencies we get involved in this, I think the better chance we are going to have an impact. So if you don't like CEQA or you think there's some problems with it, fill out one of those questionnaires and get it back to us. Thank you.
Thank you very much for attending this morning, ladies and gentlemen. We will now adjourn to the Friday, August 1st, 7:30 a.m. Orange County Water District Boardroom to the next regularly scheduled WACO meeting. The topic will be water system reliability in California, Southern California, and Orange County. Thanks very much for coming today. Yes, sir. We're going to discuss the starting times for next meeting at the WACO planning meeting. I'd invite you all to come to weigh in on that issue. Thanks very much.